Right now, there's a good chance you're holding one of these. You've looked at it maybe 40 times today. You've dropped it, cracked it, yelled at it, and fallen asleep on it. To you, it's just a phone. But the boring little slab in your hand is, with no exaggeration, the most complicated object that human beings have ever made cheap enough to hand to literally everyone. It's a phone and a camera and a television, a map, a bank, a flashlight, an entire library, and a supercomputer. And 100 years ago, every single one of those things was either the size of a room or it flat out did not exist. So how did we get from that to this? How did we take 100 years of machines, each one the size of a building, and crush them all down into a single piece of glass that you leave on the floor of your car? Buckle up. This is the origin story of the thing in your pocket. To find the very beginning, we have to go back almost 200 years to a time when sending a message to another town meant writing it down on paper and physically handing it to a guy on a horse. If you wanted to tell your cousin something, your options were simple. Wait for a letter to travel for 2 weeks or get on the horse yourself. For almost the entire history of our species, information moved at exactly the speed of a tired animal, and not one bit faster. Then in the 1840s, somebody had an idea that genuinely sounded insane at the time. What if you could send a message down a metal wire as a pulse of electricity? Not a person, not a letter, just the information itself. Pure thought racing down a copper string faster than any horse could ever dream of moving. That was the telegraph. It couldn't send your voice. It couldn't even really send words. It sent clicks, long clicks and short clicks, dots and dashes. A secret code we now call Morse code, where every letter of the alphabet became its own little rhythm of taps. The first message ever sent down that wire, back in 1844, was a little dramatic. They could have tested it with something like, "Hello," or "It works," or "Is this thing on?" Instead, the first words humanity ever sent by electricity were, "What hath God wrought?" Big, heavy, biblical words for what was basically the world's very first text message. And honestly, setting the bar way too high for the rest of us, because almost 200 years later, the average first text most people send is just, "Hey," with no punctuation and a vague sense of regret. Clicks were incredible, but clicks aren't talking. And one man looked at this little tapping machine and thought, why send a secret code when you could just send your actual human voice straight down the wire? His name was Alexander Graham Bell, and in 1876 he patented the telephone. For the first time in the history of the species, your voice could leave your body and come out of a machine in another room, another building, another town entirely. And the very first words ever spoken into a working telephone were not poetic and they were not planned. Bell supposedly just needed his assistant for something. So he leaned into his brand new world-changing invention and said, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Humanity's first ever phone call, and it was a man asking his coworker to walk across the room. We invented the most powerful communication tool on Earth purely so that we would never have to stand up again, and we have been using it for exactly that ever since. But there was a catch, a big one. In the early days, you couldn't just call someone directly. There were no numbers to dial. Your phone had a wire that ran to a building full of actual human beings, called operators, who sat in front of a giant board covered in holes and cables, and physically plugged your call into the right socket to connect you to whoever you were trying to reach. Every single call you ever made was hand-delivered by a stranger yanking wires around. And on top of that, your phone was bolted to the wall. You want to make a call? Wonderful. Go and stand by the wall and stay there. The entire time, you did not own the phone. The phone owned you. It had you on a leash, and that leash was about 3 feet long. Now, while the telephone was busy learning how to carry your voice, a completely different machine was quietly being born on the other side of town. And this machine is the real secret ingredient inside the thing in your pocket. This is the one that truly matters, the computer. But forget whatever sleek image is in your head right now, because the first true computers, built in the 1940s, were absolute monsters. We are talking about a machine that weighed somewhere around 30 tons. That is heavier than some houses. It filled an entire room, wall to wall to wall. It ran on roughly 18,000 glowing glass tubes called vacuum tubes. And these things ran blisteringly hot and burned out constantly. So there were people whose entire job, all day, every day, was to run around this beast hunting for the dead tube and swapping it out before the whole machine crashed. It drank enough electricity to dim the lights in the building. And after all of that effort, this 30-ton, room-sized, fire-breathing monster was less powerful than the calculator app on your phone that you have genuinely never once opened on purpose. So here is the puzzle. How on earth do you shrink a 30-ton room down into something that fits inside your jeans? The answer is a single invention, probably one of the most important objects ever created by anyone, and also one that most people have never even heard of. In 1947, in a research lab, a small team of scientists invented the transistor. And a transistor is, at its heart, just a tiny switch. That's all it is. It turns on and it turns off. Ones and zeros. The basic alphabet that every computer on the planet still speaks today. But this tiny switch did the exact same job as those huge glowing glass tubes, except it was microscopically small. It sipped barely any power at all, and it almost never broke. One tiny transistor could quietly replace one big, hot, fragile tube. And then engineers realized something genuinely beautiful. There was nothing stopping them from making that transistor smaller, and then smaller again, and then smaller still. They figured out how to print them, almost like ink, onto little wafers, and cram more and more of them into less and less space. They started fitting hundreds onto a single chip, then thousands, then millions. There's actually a famous prediction about this, made back in the 1960s, that said the number of these tiny switches we could squeeze onto a single chip would roughly double every couple of years. People at the time thought that sounded wildly optimistic. It held true for decade after decade after decade. It is the entire reason your technology gets faster and cheaper every single year, almost like clockwork. So picture the whole journey. The room became a cabinet. The cabinet became a box. The box became a chip the size of your fingernail. And the phone in your pocket right now, inside it, sitting on its little chips, are billions of these microscopic switches. Billions of them. Flipping on and off billions of times every second, silently while you scroll. The 30-ton monster didn't just shrink down, it learned how to walk, and it was just about ready to head outside. April 1973. A man named Martin Cooper is standing on a sidewalk in New York City, and in his hand is something that no human being has ever held before. A telephone, with no wire. Nothing connecting it to a wall, to the ground, to anything at all. Just a phone, in his hand, out in the open air. And to prove that this impossible object actually worked, he made the very first handheld mobile phone call in history. The story goes that he used that historic, world-changing moment to call up his single biggest rival, a competing engineer over at another company, purely so he could say, "Hey, guess what? I'm calling you right now, from a phone that isn't plugged into anything." The first mobile call ever made was a flex. A man invented the future specifically so he could rub it in someone's face. And honestly, I respect that completely. Now, it took about another 10 years before you could actually walk into a store and buy one of these for yourself. And when you finally could, it was, let's be honest with each other, a complete disaster. The first mobile phone you could really buy hit the market in 1983, and let me describe this beauty to you in detail. It weighed nearly 2 pounds. You held it up against the side of your head like a brick, because it essentially was one. The battery gave you about 30 minutes of talk time. 30 minutes. And then it needed roughly 10 hours to recharge. So you could talk for half an hour, and then the phone had to lie down and recover for the rest of the day, like it had just run a marathon. And the price for this miracle of modern engineering? Almost $4,000. $4,000 in 1983 money. For a phone that worked for 30 minutes and looked like a television remote designed for a giant. They literally nicknamed it the brick, partly because at a glance you genuinely could not tell it apart from an actual brick, and partly because in an emergency you had two solid options. You could call someone with it, or you could throw it straight through their window. It was enormous. It was almost completely useless. It was insanely expensive, and it changed absolutely everything. Because for the very first time in human history, the phone was no longer chained to a wall. The phone now followed you. The leash had finally been cut. The only job left was to take this 2-pound, $4,000 brick and somehow turn it into something a normal human being would actually want to carry around. And that is exactly where the 1990s come in. The 90s arrive and phones go on the single most aggressive diet in the entire history of objects. Every year, without fail, they got smaller and lighter and cheaper and tougher. The brick shrank down into a chunky little candy bar shape that you could actually fit in a pocket, as long as it was a reasonably large pocket. And right around here, something quietly showed up that would go on to completely rewire the way human beings talk to one another. Forever. The text message. The very first text message ever sent, back in 1992, said two simple words: Merry Christmas. Which is lovely. Genuinely, that's sweet. Right up until you remember how you actually had to type back then. There was no full keyboard on these phones. There were just the number keys, and each number had 3 or 4 different letters crammed onto it. So if you wanted to type a single letter S, you had to press the number 7 4 separate times, quickly, and just pray it landed on the right letter before the cursor jumped ahead. And we typed entire conversations this way. We got genuinely fast at it. People could fire off a whole paragraph from inside their pocket without even looking down at the keys. It was a real, hard-earned skill, and today it is a completely dead one, somewhere on the shelf next to blacksmithing and churning your own butter. And these phones, these little 90s and early 2000s phones, were practically indestructible. This was their golden age. You could drop one off a roof, run it over with a car, accidentally drop it in a lake, and it would ring a minute later as if absolutely nothing had happened. Which makes it genuinely insane that the phone in your pocket today, a phone 1,000 times more advanced and more powerful, will shatter into a full spiderweb of cracks if you set it down just slightly too enthusiastically on a wooden table. Somewhere along the way, we traded all of that toughness for a screen made of glass, and we have quietly regretted it every single day since. Oh, and these old phones had games. Well, one game that really mattered, a single snake, made of blocky little pixels, that crawled around the screen eating dots, getting a tiny bit longer with every dot it swallowed, until eventually it grew too long, ran straight into its own tail, and died. That was it. That was the entire game. And we were never ever happier than we were back then. There was no endless internet to distract you, no flood of notifications, no algorithm studying your every move. There was just you, a snake, and the slow, inevitable tragedy of becoming too big for your own good. We also, for reasons that are difficult to fully explain today, spent actual real money buying little musical jingles to play whenever the phone rang, specifically so that everyone standing around us would know that our phone, in particular, was the one going off. We invented the ringtone, and for one brief, strange moment in history, it counted as a personality. So now, by the mid-2000s, here is the genuinely strange situation we had managed to get ourselves into. You had a phone in one pocket. You had a totally separate little music player in your other pocket, holding all of your songs. You had a camera, an entirely separate device, hanging around your neck for taking photos. And you had a clunky, painfully slow, miserable little gadget for checking the internet that, let's be honest, absolutely everyone hated using. 4 different devices, 4 different chargers, 4 separate things to carry, to forget, to lose down the side of the couch. And the idea that went on to build the entire modern world was almost stupidly simple. Somebody finally looked at that ridiculous pile of gadgets and asked the obvious question. What if it was all just one thing? What if your phone was also your camera, and also your music player, and also the internet, all of it living together inside a single object? Now, people had actually been trying to mash these things together for a while. There was a phone all the way back in 1994 that already had a touchscreen and could handle little tasks, and was, by most honest definitions, the very first smartphone. but it was bulky. It was years ahead of its time, and almost nobody bought one. There were phones built mainly for typing out emails that office workers became famously, hopelessly addicted to. And around the year 2000, somebody stuck a tiny camera onto the back of a phone for the first time. The photos were blurry, grainy little potato pictures, and we absolutely loved them anyway. All of the pieces were sitting right there on the table. Someone just had to slam them together properly. And in 2007, someone finally did. In 2007, a phone was revealed that took the entire existing rulebook and threw it directly into the trash. It got rid of the buttons, all of them. The whole front of the phone was now just a screen, a smooth sheet of glass that you controlled by touching it with your bare finger, pinching, swiping, tapping. It was a phone and a music player and the real internet, the actual full internet, the same one you had on your computer at home, all fused together into one slab of glass that fit neatly in the palm of your hand. And a lot of people genuinely thought it was a joke. A phone with no real keyboard? You expect us to type on glass? Ridiculous, they said. It will never catch on. That ridiculous gimmick is now sitting in roughly half of all the pockets on the entire planet, billions of them. And then, the very next year, the final piece clicked into place, and this is the part that truly made the phone limitless. They built a store that lived inside the phone itself, where any person anywhere on Earth could download brand new abilities for their device. We call them apps. And this changed everything because it meant the phone was no longer one finished product that did a fixed list of things. It was now a blank slate that could become, quite literally, anything. Tap a button, and your phone is a map that knows exactly where you're standing. Tap again, and it's your bank. Tap again, and it's a television. A taxi you can summon to your door. A translator for almost any language on Earth. A spirit level. A flashlight. A guitar tuner. A heart rate monitor. The phone stopped being a single device and quietly became a doorway to a million devices, all living together inside the same piece of glass. So let's go all the way back to that boring little slab sitting on your nightstand right now. The one you swipe at without thinking, the one you ignore. Let's actually take a proper look at what you're holding. Inside that piece of glass are billions of those microscopic switches, the great-great-grandchildren of an 18,000 tube monster that once filled an entire room and weighed as much as a house. The whole long history we just walked through together, the telegraph, the wall phone, the operators with their cables, the 30-ton computer, the transistor, the brick, the snake, all of it, collapsed and folded and crushed down into a single object that fits in the palm of one hand. And here is the one fact that should genuinely break your brain a little. In 1969, human beings flew to the moon. They built a spacecraft, pointed it at another world, and landed softly on the surface. The computer that guided that entire mission, that ran all the calculations to get our species to the moon and safely back home again, was an absolute marvel of its time. Your phone is millions of times more powerful than it was. Just let that sit for a second. You are carrying in your pocket right now, completely casually, probably right next to some lint and an old receipt, more raw computing power than the entire space program that put a living human being onto the surface of another world. And you primarily use it to watch short videos of people falling over and to argue with strangers you are never going to meet. Think about everything that got swallowed up to make this one object possible. Every room-sized machine, every telephone bolted to a wall, every camera, every map, every towering wall of library books, every television set from the last 200 years. All of it got shrunk down, fused together, and then handed out to billions of people for roughly the price of a decent pair of shoes. It is, by an enormous margin, the most complicated object that the vast majority of human beings will ever hold in their hands. It is the end result of 2 full centuries of some of the smartest people who ever lived, stacking one breakthrough on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, and we leave it lying face down on the floor of the car. We get annoyed when it loads too slowly. We let out a heavy sigh when it tells us it needs charging. That is the origin of the thing in your pocket. It took our entire species almost 200 years, thousands upon thousands of separate inventions, and more brilliant minds than you could ever hope to count. And you unlock it 100 times a day without even glancing down at it. Here's the thing though, every single piece of technology around you has an origin story that is exactly this insane. The Wi-Fi quietly connecting you to the entire planet, the car sitting out in your driveway, the little camera that somehow folds a whole world down into a tiny square of glass. Every one of them began as something huge, clumsy, expensive, and almost magical, and then got crushed down into something you don't even think about anymore. And we are going to tell every single one of those stories. So if you want to find out where the rest of your world actually came from, this is the place to be. Stick around. There is a whole lot more origin left to uncover.